The day began like any other at the bustling airport in the heart of the city. Travelers hurried through the terminals, families reunited with tearful embraces, and the usual announcements echoed overhead. Among the throng of passengers boarding Flight 873 to Denver was Sarah Thompson, a woman who immediately stood out. Clad in an oversized sweatshirt that hugged her protruding belly and clutching a small travel bag, she walked with a deliberate pace, occasionally rubbing her abdomen in what seemed to be an attempt to reassure herself, or perhaps others around her. Sarah was seated in 14C, an aisle seat. A man in a business suit was already seated by the window, engrossed in his laptop, while an older woman sat in the middle, knitting quietly. Sarah smiled politely as she slid into her seat, letting out a small sigh of relief as if the hardest part of her journey was already behind her. Around her, passengers settled in, chatting about their plans, complaining about cramped legroom, or scrolling through their phones. Nothing seemed amiss, yet a subtle tension was about to crack the veneer of this otherwise ordinary flight. As the plane began taxiing, Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A flight attendant, a tall woman with a calm yet commanding demeanor, approached her with a warm smile. "Ma'am, can I help you store your bag in the overhead compartment? It might give you more space." Sarah hesitated, clutching her bag tightly. "No, thank you. I'd rather keep it here with me," she replied, her voice tinged with nervousness. The flight attendant nodded but glanced down briefly at Sarah's belly, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. Something about Sarah's posture, or perhaps her overly protective grip on the bag, seemed off. The plane finally took off, and as it climbed into the sky, the passengers relaxed into their routines. Sarah, however, appeared increasingly uneasy. She fidgeted with the hem of her sweatshirt, adjusting her belly repeatedly as if trying to make it more comfortable. The older woman beside her, noticing Sarah's movements, leaned over with a gentle smile. "First baby?" she asked kindly. Sarah forced a smile. "Yes. First one. A little nervous about flying, that's all." "Oh, you'll do fine," the woman assured her. "Just keep breathing. And don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it." Sarah nodded, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the small bottle of water tucked into the seat pocket. The older woman gave her an encouraging pat on the arm before returning to her knitting. It wasn't long before a small child from a nearby row wandered into the aisle, despite his mother's attempts to keep him seated. The boy, no older than 4, toddled toward Sarah's seat, giggling and playing with a toy car. Before anyone could stop him, he bumped into Sarah's knee, causing her to jolt and let out a sharp gasp. The toy car dropped to the floor, and the boy's mother hurried over to scoop him up. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Sarah, however, didn't respond. She was frozen, her hands gripping her belly protectively. The commotion caught the attention of the flight attendant, who returned to check on Sarah. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. Yes, I'm fine," Sarah stammered, waving her hand dismissively. "It's just, I think I need some water." The flight attendant handed her a fresh bottle and lingered for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning Sarah's posture and demeanor. Something wasn't adding up. As the attendant walked back to the galley, she exchanged a look with her colleague, a younger man who was restocking the beverage cart. 14C, she whispered. "Keep an eye on her. Something's not right." The passengers in nearby rows had started to notice Sarah's odd behavior as well. One man leaned over to his seatmate, murmuring, "Did you see how she freaked out when that kid bumped her? Weird, right?" His seatmate shrugged. "Maybe she's just nervous about flying. People get all sorts of anxieties." But the murmurs didn't stop. Sarah's belly, noticeably lumpy and uneven in shape, had become a silent subject of speculation. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, tension began to ripple through the cabin. The older woman beside Sarah shifted uncomfortably, occasionally glancing at her seatmate with a mixture of curiosity and unease. An hour into the flight, The lead flight attendant approached Sarah again, this time with a more direct approach. "Ma'am, I notice you seem a little uncomfortable. Are you feeling all right? If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." "I'm fine," Sarah replied quickly, her voice cracking slightly. "Just trying to rest." The flight attendant hesitated, then leaned in closer. "If it's okay with you, I'd like to have a quick word with you in private. It's just routine." Sarah's eyes widened. "Why?" "I'm fine. I told you I'm fine." The attendant remained calm but firm. "It's just a quick check. Nothing to worry about. We want to make sure all our passengers are safe and comfortable." The older woman beside Sarah spoke up. "If you're feeling unwell, dear, maybe you should let them help you." Sarah's breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might refuse outright. But with dozens of eyes now subtly watching her, she had no choice. Reluctantly, she stood up, clutching her bag tightly, and followed the flight attendant toward the galley. The murmurs grew louder as soon as she left her seat. "Something's definitely going on," one passenger whispered. "Did you see how she was holding her stomach? It doesn't look normal." In the galley, Sarah stood facing the lead flight attendant and her colleague. "What is this about?" she asked, her tone defensive. "We just want to make sure you're okay," the lead attendant said. "Can you please confirm how far along you are in your pregnancy?" Sarah hesitated. 7 months. Almost 8. "And you're traveling alone?" the younger attendant asked. "Yes, my husband is meeting me in Denver." The attendants exchanged a glance. "Ma'am," the lead attendant said carefully, "we've noticed some inconsistencies. Your belly doesn't seem quite natural. Are you absolutely certain you're being truthful with us?" Sarah's face flushed red. "What are you implying?" she snapped. "That I'm lying. This is harassment." Before the attendants could respond, the plane suddenly jolted with mild turbulence, sending Sarah stumbling backward. In that brief moment, her sweatshirt shifted, and so did her belly, which emitted an audible clunk as something hard struck against her hip. The silence that followed was deafening. The lead attendant's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I need you to stay here while we notify the captain." "What? No, you can't do this," Sarah protested, but her voice was drowned out by the rising tension in the cabin. The plane began its descent, not to Denver, but back to the airport it had just left, where security waited to uncover the full truth behind Sarah's charade. Sarah Thompson wasn't supposed to be on that plane. Just days earlier, she had been at her small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city, staring at an eviction notice tacked to her front door. The words blurred together as tears welled in her eyes. "Pay $3,200 or vacate the premises within 30 days. For Sarah, who was juggling 2 part-time jobs and caring for her aging mother, the number might as well have been $1 million. She had spent the past few months drowning in debt, the bills piling up faster than she could pay them. Her part-time cashier job barely covered groceries, and her evening cleaning shifts at a local office building paid just enough to keep the electricity on. Her mother's medical expenses, despite government assistance, had drained her savings to nearly nothing. Sarah was at her breaking point. That's when she got the call. A man with a gravelly voice introduced himself as Rick and claimed to have a solution to all her problems. She didn't ask how he knew about her financial troubles. She figured desperate people like her weren't hard to find. Rick offered her a deal. Deliver a small package to Denver, and she'd walk away with $5,000 in cash. No questions asked. At first, Sarah laughed at the absurdity of it. "I'm not a drug mule," she had said, shaking her head as if to dismiss the idea outright. But as the days went on, and the eviction notice loomed larger, her resolve began to crumble. Rick was persistent, calling her twice more to remind her how easy it would be. "One quick trip," he'd said. "You're not crossing any borders. No one will even know. And your money problems gone." By the third call, Sarah was out of options. She reluctantly agreed to meet Rick at a diner on the edge of town, a seedy establishment where the coffee tasted like burnt rubber and the staff didn't ask questions. Rick slid into the booth across from her, a gruff-looking man with a leather jacket and sunglasses that he didn't bother to remove. He pushed a small duffel bag across the table. "Here's the deal," he said, leaning in. "You strap this on, act like you're 8 months pregnant, and get on the flight. It's just jewelry, nothing illegal, but let's just say the paperwork isn't exactly above board. You deliver it to my guy in Denver. He'll give you the money, and you're done. Easy." Sarah's hands trembled as she unzipped the bag, revealing a fake pregnancy belly lined with hidden compartments. This is insane," she muttered, looking around nervously. "It's foolproof," Rick insisted. "People see a pregnant woman, and their guard goes down. No one's going to question you. Just keep your head down and stick to the script." She hesitated for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing with doubts and fears. But when she thought about her mother's fragile health, her mounting bills, and the eviction notice threatening to take away the only home they had left, she reluctantly nodded. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." The morning of the flight, Sarah woke up before dawn, her stomach churning with anxiety. She carefully strapped on the fake belly, adjusting it in front of the mirror until it looked convincing. She practiced walking with a slight waddle, mimicking the pregnant women she'd seen at the grocery store. With her oversized sweatshirt and loose-fitting jeans, she looked the part. But inside, she was a bundle of nerves. At the airport, every step felt like an eternity. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the security personnel as she passed through the checkpoints. Her heart pounded when the metal detector beeped, but it was just her belt buckle. The TSA agent waved her through with a bored expression, and Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. As she approached the gate, her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. The waiting area was filled with families, business travelers, and vacationers, all oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She clutched her boarding pass tightly, her palms slick with sweat. When her group was called to board, she forced herself to stay calm, smiling politely at the gate agent as she handed over her pass. Once on the plane, she found her seat and sank into it, her entire body tense. She knew she had to blend in, to act like any other tired traveler, but the weight of her decision pressed down on her like a lead blanket. She kept rehearsing Rick's instructions in her mind. "If anyone asks, you're 7 months along. You're flying to see your husband. You're tired but excited about the baby." It was a simple story, but every lie felt like a boulder in her throat. As the plane began to fill up, Sarah's unease grew. She noticed the flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, their sharp eyes scanning the passengers. A young child ran past her seat, giggling as his mother chased after him, and for a moment, Sarah's lips curved into a small smile. But the fleeting sense of normalcy vanished when the boy bumped into her leg, sending a jolt of panic through her. The fake belly shifted slightly, and she froze, her breath caught in her throat. The mother apologized profusely, and Sarah forced a smile, mumbling that it was fine. But the moment left her rattled, and she could feel the eyes of the nearby passengers lingering on her a little too long. She adjusted the belly, trying to make it look more natural. But the damage was done. People were watching her now, and every small movement felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 suspicions. When the flight attendant approached her for the first time, Sarah nearly jumped out of her seat. The woman's polite smile did little to calm her nerves. "Can I help you store your bag, ma'am?" she asked. Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I'll keep it with me." The attendant's eyes flickered to Sarah's belly, then back to her face. "All right," she said, her tone neutral but probing. She walked away, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air. She knew she had to be more careful, but her anxiety was making it harder to think clearly. As the plane taxied to the runway, Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She reminded herself why she was doing this: her mother, the eviction notice, the chance to finally escape the crushing weight of her financial struggles. but the guilt was suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of being discovered. When the flight attendant returned a second time, her questions were more direct. Sarah tried to stick to the script, but her voice wavered, and she could see the doubt in the attendant's eyes. The whispers among the passengers grew louder, and Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She knew she was running out of time. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Sarah tried to regain her composure. She gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, as if holding on for dear life. Around her, the hum of the plane's engines mixed with the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter from passengers. Yet to Sarah, it felt as though everyone was staring. Every laugh was at her expense, and every conversation was about her. Her pulse raced as she tried to focus on anything but the weight of the fake belly strapped to her torso. The older woman beside her, who had been quietly knitting, leaned over with a kind smile. "You know, I remember my first pregnancy. Flying at this stage is never easy," she said softly. Sarah forced a weak smile, nodding slightly. "Yeah, it's a lot," she mumbled. Her voice felt distant, almost robotic, as if the words were coming from someone else. "Well, you're doing great, dear. If you need anything, just let me know," the woman added, patting Sarah's arm gently before returning to her knitting. Sarah nodded again, her heart pounding. Every interaction felt like a test, every glance a potential discovery. She could feel the sweat pooling at the small of her back, her body reacting to the relentless surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She tried to distract herself by looking out the window, but the sight of endless clouds only reminded her of how trapped she was. Meanwhile, in the galley at the back of the plane, the flight attendants were having a hushed conversation. The lead attendant, Megan, was speaking to her colleague, a young man named Jason, who had noticed Sarah's odd behavior earlier. "She's acting strange," Jason said, keeping his voice low. "Did you see how she clutched her bag during takeoff? And her belly? It doesn't look right." It shifted when the kid bumped her. Megan nodded thoughtfully. "I saw it too. And she got defensive when I offered to help with her bag. Something's not adding up." "What should we do?" Jason asked, glancing toward the row where Sarah was seated. Megan frowned, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "We need to approach this delicately. We can't accuse her outright, but we also can't ignore it. I'll check in with her again. If she's hiding something, she'll slip up eventually." Back at her seat, Sarah's anxiety was reaching a breaking point. The whispers from the passengers behind her were growing louder. She could hear snippets of their conversation. Words like weird, suspicious, and fake floated to her ears. She clenched her jaw, trying to block it out, but it was no use. She knew they were talking about her. The child from earlier, now sitting a few rows back with his mother, pointed toward Sarah and said loudly, "Mommy, that lady has a funny belly." The boy's innocent observation sent a ripple of awkward chuckles through the cabin. But for Sarah, it felt like the world had stopped. Her face burned with embarrassment as she hunched over slightly, as if trying to disappear into her seat. A few minutes later, Megan approached Sarah again, her expression calm but serious. "Ma'am, I hope you're feeling all right. Can I get you anything? Water? A blanket?" Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, I'm fine," she said, her voice sharp and defensive. Megan didn't back down. "You know, if you're feeling unwell, it's important that you let us know. We're here to help." "I said I'm fine," Sarah snapped, her tone harsher than she intended. Several passengers turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the tension in her voice. Megan's professional demeanor didn't falter. She crouched slightly to meet Sarah's eye level. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to press, but your behavior has raised some concerns. We're just trying to ensure everyone's safety, including yours." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the situation bearing down on her like a physical force. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's step into the galley for a moment," Megan suggested gently, but firmly. "It's a little more private, and we can talk there." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing for an excuse. But with every passenger in the surrounding rows now watching her intently, she realized she had no choice. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, clutching her bag tightly. She could feel dozens of eyes on her as she followed Megan toward the back of the plane. In the galley, Megan and Jason stood facing Sarah, their expressions neutral but alert. Megan began cautiously. "Ma'am, we're not here to accuse you of anything, but we've noticed some inconsistencies, and we need to address them. For example, your belly. It doesn't appear to be moving naturally, which is unusual for someone in the later stages of pregnancy." Sarah felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay upright. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason spoke up, his tone gentle but probing. "When that child bumped into you earlier, there was a sound. A clunk. That's not something we'd expect from a pregnant belly." Sarah's mind raced, grasping for a plausible explanation. It's a support brace," she blurted out. "My doctor recommended it because of complications with my pregnancy. It's made of hard plastic." Megan and Jason exchanged a look. Megan's tone remained calm but firm. "Ma'am, we want to believe you, but we need to ensure everyone's safety. If you're carrying something you shouldn't be, it's better to be honest now." "I'm not carrying anything," Sarah said, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. I'm just trying to get to Denver to see my husband." Her outburst attracted the attention of a passenger seated near the galley, who peeked around the corner. Megan motioned for Jason to close the curtain, shielding them from prying eyes. "All right," Megan said, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "If there's nothing to hide, then you won't mind letting us verify that everything is as you say." Sarah froze. "Verify?" she echoed, her throat dry. "We need to ask you to remove your outer sweatshirt," Megan said, "just to confirm that the brace you mentioned is what's causing the issue." "No," Sarah blurted out, stepping back. "I mean, I'm not comfortable with that. This is an invasion of my privacy." Megan's expression hardened. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to notify the captain and involve law enforcement when we land." Sarah's chest tightened as panic set in. She realized she was out of options. Reluctantly, she pulled the sweatshirt over her head, revealing the fake pregnancy belly strapped tightly to her torso. The sight of it was damning. Megan and Jason exchanged a glance, their suspicions confirmed. "What's in the belly?" Megan asked, her tone sharp now. Sarah's shoulders slumped, and tears welled in her eyes. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Please, I can explain." But her explanation would have to wait, as Megan stepped away to inform the captain that they had a serious situation on their hands. The plane was about to take an unexpected detour, and Sarah's carefully constructed lie was about to unravel in front of everyone. The tension in the galley was suffocating. Sarah stood frozen, her sweatshirt crumpled in her trembling hands, and the fake belly exposed for all to see. The flight attendants, Megan and Jason, stared at her in stunned silence, processing the revelation. Outside the curtain, the muffled hum of passengers chatting was a sharp contrast to the charged atmosphere within. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to think of a way out of this mess. "Ma'am," Megan said, her voice now firm and commanding, "we need to know exactly what you're carrying. The safety of everyone on this plane depends on your honesty." "I told you, it's not dangerous," Sarah stammered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It's just jewelry. Nothing illegal. Please, I didn't mean any harm." Jason stepped forward cautiously, his voice calmer but still insistent. "Jewelry. Then why go to these lengths to hide it? This doesn't make sense unless there's more to the story." Sarah broke down, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. "I didn't have a choice," she choked out. "I needed the money. They said it was safe. They said no one would get hurt." "They?" Megan pressed. "Who are you talking about? Are you working with someone? Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. She had been warned not to mention Rick or his associates under any circumstances. But now, trapped in this moment, the weight of her situation became unbearable. I don't know their names, she lied, her voice barely audible. A man approached me, said he'd pay me if I delivered this to someone in Denver. Before Megan or Jason could ask another question, the intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking," the calm voice announced. "Due to an unexpected situation, we will be returning to the airport. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the flight crew. We apologize for the inconvenience." Sarah's heart sank. The murmurs outside the curtain grew louder as passengers began speculating about the sudden change in plans. "What's going on?" someone asked. "Are we in danger?" Back in the galley, Megan turned to Jason. "Stay here with her. I'm going to brief the captain." Jason nodded and positioned himself between Sarah and the exit to the main cabin. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Sarah slumped into a jump seat, her head in her hands. The fake belly, now unstrapped, sat on the floor beside her, an incriminating piece of evidence that seemed to mock her. "I didn't want to do this," she muttered. "I didn't want any of this." Jason crossed his arms, leaning against the galley counter. "Then why did you?" he asked. "You don't seem like the type to smuggle anything. What's your story?" Sarah hesitated, unsure whether she should even try to explain. But something in Jason's expression, perhaps a flicker of genuine curiosity, made her start talking. "I'm broke," she said bluntly. "My mom's sick. The bills keep piling up. They're going to evict us any day now. When this guy approached me with the offer, I didn't see another way." Jason's expression softened slightly, but he remained vigilant. "That doesn't excuse putting everyone on this plane at risk. You should have known better." "I did know better," Sarah snapped, surprising even herself with the force of her words. "But what was I supposed to do? Watch my mom get thrown out on the street? Let her die because I couldn't afford her medication? You don't know what it's like to have no options." Jason was silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "Look, I get it. Desperation makes people do crazy things. But you could have hurt a lot of innocent people today. Whatever's in that belly, it's going to catch up to you one way or another." Megan returned a few minutes later, her expression grim. "The captain's informed the authorities," she said. "Security and law enforcement will be waiting for us when we land. They'll handle it from here." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Law enforcement," she whispered. "No, please, you don't understand. If they find out I talked, the people who gave me this, they'll come after me. They'll come after my family." Megan's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying you're in danger?" Sarah nodded frantically. "Yes, these people, they're not just criminals. They're dangerous. If they think I betrayed them." Her words were cut off by a sharp knock on the galley door. Jason opened it just enough to see a nervous passenger standing there. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice shaking. "Is everything okay? Some of us are getting really worried." Jason offered a tight smile. "Everything's under control, sir. Please return to your seat." As Jason closed the door, Megan turned back to Sarah. "If what you're saying is true, you need to tell the authorities everything. They can protect you." Sarah shook her head vehemently. "You don't get it. These people have connections. They'll find me, no matter where I go." Megan frowned, clearly torn. "I don't know what else to tell you, Sarah. You made this choice, and now you're going to have to face the consequences." The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. Sarah remained in the galley under Jason's watchful eye, her mind racing as she tried to figure out a way to salvage the situation. But every avenue she considered seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. Her life as she knew it was over. When the plane finally landed, the authorities were waiting on the tarmac. Sarah was escorted off the aircraft in handcuffs, her face pale and her eyes downcast. Passengers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the commotion, Their curiosity mingled with unease. Some clapped, relieved that the situation had been resolved, while others whispered among themselves, speculating about what had just unfolded. As Sarah was led away by the police, Megan and Jason exchanged a glance. "Well," Jason said, breaking the silence, "that's not something you see every day." "No," Megan agreed, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "And I hope I never see it again." For Sarah, the nightmare was only beginning. The contents of the fake belly were confiscated and catalogued. Dozens of small velvet pouches filled with uncut diamonds and rare gemstones, valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The authorities quickly pieced together that Sarah had been a pawn in a much larger smuggling operation, but proving her involvement, and her claims of coercion, would be a long and difficult process. As she sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room at the airport, Sarah realized that her life had reached a crossroads. She could either cooperate with the authorities and risk the wrath of the people who had put her in this position, or she could stay silent and face the full weight of the law on her own. It was a decision that would shape her future, and the futures of everyone she cared about, for years to come. The fallout from Sarah's dramatic arrest reverberated far beyond the airport. By the time she was escorted to a police van, still wearing the remnants of her fake pregnancy disguise, several passengers had already begun sharing snippets of the incident online. Grainy cell phone videos showed Sarah being led away in handcuffs, her face pale and tear-streaked, while captions speculated wildly about what had happened. Within hours, hashtags like #FakePregnancyScandal and #SmugglerOnBoard began trending, turning the incident into a viral sensation. Back at the terminal, law enforcement and airport security swarmed the plane, questioning passengers and collecting evidence. Megan and Jason, the flight attendants who had confronted Sarah, were pulled aside for detailed debriefings. She claimed she was desperate. Megan explained to the investigators, said she had no choice because of her financial situation. But it was clear she wasn't telling us everything. Jason chimed in, his voice more skeptical. "I'm not sure how much of her story I believe. She was hiding something big. People don't go to these lengths unless there's a lot more at stake." As the investigation unfolded, authorities discovered the full extent of Sarah's predicament. The contents of the fake belly, a carefully packed collection of uncut diamonds and rare gemstones, were valued at over $500,000. The items were traced back to a series of unsolved jewel thefts that had plagued the region for months. Sarah, it seemed, had been recruited as an unwitting mule in a much larger smuggling operation. But the revelations didn't stop there. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered links between the stolen jewels and a notorious criminal syndicate operating out of the city. The man Sarah identified as Rick, who had coerced her into the scheme, was already a person of interest in several ongoing cases. The authorities realized that Sarah might hold the key to dismantling the operation, but only if they could convince her to cooperate. Meanwhile, news of the incident continued to spread, sparking heated debates on social media and in the press. Some commentators were quick to condemn Sarah, labeling her a criminal and questioning how she could endanger an entire plane for her own gain. Others, however, expressed sympathy for her situation, pointing out the systemic issues that had likely driven her to such desperation. Local news outlets descended on the small apartment complex where Sarah and her mother lived, interviewing neighbors and trying to piece together a portrait of the woman behind the scandal. "She was always quiet, kept to herself," one neighbor said, "but you could tell she was struggling. I used to see her coming home late at night from work, looking exhausted." Another neighbor, an older man with a soft spot for Sarah's mother, was more defensive. "She's a good girl," he insisted. "Takes care of her mom, works hard. If she did something wrong, it's because she didn't see another way." In the days following her arrest, Sarah's world shrank to the cold, windowless walls of a holding cell. The authorities offered her a deal. If she cooperated and provided information about Rick and his associates, they would reduce the charges against her. But Sarah was terrified. She knew that if the syndicate discovered her cooperation, her life, and her mother's, would be at risk. During one particularly tense interrogation, an FBI agent laid out the stakes. "Listen, Sarah," he said, leaning forward across the table. "You're in a tough spot, no doubt about it. But the people who roped you into this, they're dangerous. And if you don't help us take them down, they're going to keep exploiting people like you." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she shook her head. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They'll kill me. They'll kill my mom. I can't." The agent sighed, rubbing his temples. "If you stay quiet, you're going to prison for a long time. And when you get out, those same people will still be out there, doing the same thing to someone else. You can stop this, Sarah, but you have to decide." The pressure was unbearable. Sarah spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, replaying the events that had led her to this point. She thought about her mother, who had no idea what had happened and was likely waiting by the window, wondering why Sarah hadn't come home. She thought about the people on the plane, the passengers she had unwittingly put in danger, and the flight attendants who had seen through her facade. Most of all, she thought about Rick and the dark promises he had made. As Sarah grappled with her choice, the story took on a life of its own. Talk shows debated the ethics of her situation, with some pundits framing her as a victim of systemic failure, and others painting her as a willing accomplice. Advocates for social justice used her case as an example of the desperation faced by those living in poverty, while critics argued that financial struggles were no excuse for criminal behavior. In her neighborhood, the fallout was equally intense. Reporters camped outside the apartment complex, hoping for a comment from Sarah's mother, who had been shielded from the media by sympathetic neighbors. Community leaders organized meetings to discuss the broader issues raised by the incident, from rising poverty rates to the exploitation of vulnerable individuals by criminal organizations. Despite the chaos surrounding her, Sarah found an unexpected ally in Megan, the flight attendant who had first confronted her. After hearing about Sarah's dire circumstances, Megan reached out to a lawyer she knew specialized in cases involving coerced criminal activity. The lawyer, a sharp and compassionate woman named Andrea Lopez, agreed to take on Sarah's case pro bono. During their first meeting, Andrea laid out the options in stark terms. "You're scared, and that's understandable," she said. "But if we're going to get you out of this, you need to trust me. The best chance you have is to cooperate with the authorities. If we can prove that you were coerced, we can build a case for leniency." Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling. "What if they come after my mom? I can't risk her life." Andrea nodded. "We'll make sure she's protected. The FBI has resources for this kind of situation. But you have to be honest with me about everything, every detail, every person involved. Can you do that?" It was the hardest decision Sarah had ever made. But as she looked into Andrea's steady gaze, she felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the ordeal began. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The decision set off a chain of events that would change not only Sarah's life, but also the lives of countless others. With her cooperation, law enforcement was able to build a case against Rick and his associates, leading to a series of high-profile arrests that dismantled a major smuggling ring. The news sent shockwaves through the city, with headlines praising the operation as a major victory against organized crime. For Sarah, the road to redemption was long and fraught with challenges. She spent months in legal proceedings, testifying against the syndicate and working with social workers to rebuild her life. While her cooperation earned her a reduced sentence, she still faced public scrutiny and the lingering stigma of her actions. Yet amid the difficulties, there were moments of hope and connection. Community members rallied around her mother, ensuring she had the support she needed while Sarah was away. Megan and Jason, the flight attendants who had been pivotal in uncovering the scheme, stayed in touch, offering words of encouragement and checking in on Sarah's progress. As the dust settled, Sarah emerged from the ordeal forever changed. She dedicated herself to advocating for others in desperate situations, sharing her story in the hopes of preventing others from falling into the same traps. And while the scars of her experience would never fully fade, she found strength in the lessons she had learned and the connections she had forged along the way. Months turned into years, and the story of Sarah Thompson gradually faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals and fresher controversies. But for Sarah, the events of that fateful day on the plane continued to shape her life and her identity. Her cooperation with law enforcement had come at a steep price, not just in terms of the reduced sentence she served, but also in the constant fear she lived with, knowing the criminal syndicate she had helped expose might seek revenge. Yet, despite the risks, Sarah's journey was far from over. After serving her sentence, Sarah returned to her community a changed person. Her apartment was gone, and her mother, now in a care facility paid for by the government's Victim Assistance Program, greeted her with tearful relief. But Sarah knew she couldn't simply return to the life she had lived before. Her name carried weight now, not just as the woman who had once faked a pregnancy to smuggle stolen jewels, but also as someone who had dared to take a stand against a powerful criminal network. Her first step toward rebuilding her life was finding work, but the stigma of her past made it nearly impossible. Applications were met with polite rejections or no responses at all, and interviews often ended abruptly once her background came to light. Frustrated but determined, Sarah decided to turn her experience into something meaningful. She began volunteering at a local nonprofit that provided support to women in crisis, those facing domestic abuse, homelessness, or financial despair, much like she had once endured. The work was humbling. Sarah met women from all walks of life, each with their own stories of struggle and survival. Some were young mothers fleeing abusive relationships. Others were older women grappling with unemployment and eviction. Sarah shared her own story with them, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was hope for redemption. Her honesty and vulnerability resonated deeply, and soon she became a trusted mentor for many of the women she worked with. One woman in particular, Angela, reminded Sarah of herself. A single mother of two, Angela was on the brink of losing her home and had been approached by a shady acquaintance offering her quick cash in exchange for transporting merchandise across state lines. When Angela confided in Sarah, her voice trembling with fear and desperation, Sarah felt the weight of her own past choices all over again. "Don't do it," Sarah said firmly, placing a hand on Angela's shoulder. "I know it feels like there's no other way, but trust me, there is. I'll help you find it." With Sarah's guidance, Angela connected with legal aid services and community programs that provided temporary housing and job training. Watching Angela rebuild her life was a turning point for Sarah. She realized that while she couldn't erase her past, she could use it to help others avoid the same mistakes. Sarah's dedication didn't go unnoticed. The nonprofit's director, a pragmatic but compassionate woman named Valerie, offered Sarah a paid position as a community outreach coordinator. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance for Sarah to prove to herself and the world that she was more than her worst mistakes. She threw herself into the work, organizing workshops on financial literacy, legal rights, and employment resources. She even collaborated with local law enforcement to create programs aimed at preventing vulnerable individuals from being exploited by criminal organizations. But the shadows of her past lingered. Late at night, Sarah would lie awake, haunted by the fear that someone from the syndicate might track her down. She had relocated to a new city under a different name as part of her plea agreement, but the anxiety never fully left her. Her phone calls with her mother were a lifeline, grounding her in moments when the fear threatened to consume her. One day, Sarah received a letter from Megan, the flight attendant who had played a pivotal role in uncovering her deception. Megan wrote about how the incident had changed her own perspective, making her more empathetic toward passengers who seemed to be struggling. "What happened that day could have ended so much worse," Megan wrote. "But it also opened my eyes to the reality that not all wrongdoers are bad people. Some are just lost. I'm glad you found your way." The letter moved Sarah deeply. She wrote back, thanking Megan for her kindness and sharing how her life had changed. The two women began corresponding regularly, and their unlikely friendship became another source of strength for Sarah. As Sarah settled into her new life, she also began reflecting on the broader issues that had led her to that desperate moment on the plane. She started speaking at schools, community centers, and even corporate events, sharing her story not just as a tale of personal redemption, but as a call to action. "No one wakes up one day and decides to smuggle stolen goods," she told her audiences. "It's the result of a system that fails people, fails to provide opportunities, support, and safety. We need to do better." Her speeches gained attention, and soon she was invited to participate in policy discussions and panels on poverty, crime prevention, and social justice. Though she was initially hesitant, after all, she was just a woman trying to rebuild her life. Sarah realized that her voice carried weight precisely because of her experiences. She wasn't speaking as an academic or a politician, but as someone who had lived the consequences of systemic failure firsthand. Over time, Sarah's efforts began to make a tangible impact. The programs she helped develop at the nonprofit expanded, serving more people and receiving recognition from local government agencies. She worked with law enforcement to create training modules for officers on recognizing and addressing coercion in criminal activity. And through it all, she continued mentoring women like Angela, ensuring that her journey of redemption was tied to lifting others up. But the most transformative moment came when Sarah was invited to testify before a congressional committee on human trafficking and organized crime. Standing before the lawmakers, flanked by victims, advocates, and law enforcement officials, Sarah felt a surge of nerves. Yet as she began to speak, her voice steady and clear, she realized how far she had come. "I'm not here to excuse what I did," she told the committee. "What I did was wrong, and I've paid for it. But I'm here to tell you that desperation makes people vulnerable to exploitation. If we want to stop crimes like smuggling and trafficking, we need to address the root causes: poverty, lack of education, and the absence of a safety net for those who fall through the cracks." Her testimony was met with applause and sparked renewed discussions about policy reforms. For Sarah, it was a moment of closure, not because her past was erased, but because she had finally reclaimed her narrative. In the years that followed, Sarah continued to live a quiet but impactful life. She became a fixture in her community, known not as the woman with the fake pregnancy, but as an advocate, a mentor, and a symbol of resilience. And while she still carried the weight of her mistakes, she also carried the knowledge that she had turned them into something meaningful. In the end, Sarah's journey wasn't about escaping her past. It was about transforming it. Her story became a testament to the power of redemption, not just for herself, but for the countless lives she touched along the way. And though the memories of that flight would always linger, they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light.